Imagine slogging through the jungle while chemicals rain from the sky, turning the trees orange and your lungs worse. Every step could set off a booby trap. Villages wiped out overnight. Prisoners vanish into tiger cages. Barbed wire boxes left in the sun until men can't even sit upright. That was Vietnam. And this is a disturbing Vietnam War iceberg. Tier 1. The Burning Monk, 1963. Before the airstrikes and body counts, and before American troops got fully involved, the first real sign that something was deeply wrong in Vietnam came from a street corner in Saigon, where a man sat down in the middle of traffic, poured gasoline over his head, and lit a match. His name was Thich Quang Duc, a Buddhist monk in his mid-60s who'd finally had enough. The South Vietnamese government, led by President Ngo Dinh Diem, has been waging a quiet war on Buddhism in favor of his own Catholic agenda. Even though the vast majority of the population was Buddhist, holidays were banned, religious flags were outlawed, and if anyone protested this, even peacefully, they'd be shot and killed in the streets. The people in power called it maintaining order, but it was really systemic suppression, and Quang Duc decided the world needed to see it for what it was. On June 11th, 1963, he stepped out of an Austin sedan, sat cross-legged at a busy intersection, poured gasoline over him, and set himself on fire. He just sat there, completely still, while flames consumed him and the crowd around him panicked. Other monks blocked off the scene and kept people back, even though most were too stunned to move or speak in the first place. Reporters were tipped off the night before, and Malcolm Brown, an American journalist, showed up with his camera. The photo he took circled the globe within hours, and it did exactly what the monks wanted it to do. President Kennedy saw it and said, "No news picture in history has generated so much emotion around the world." Diem's brutal tactics turned into an international scandal and started making headlines around the world. The U.S., which had been backing him until then, began pulling away because his leadership had now become a liability. But that's not where this story ends. When the monks recremated Quang Duc's body at his funeral, his heart reportedly refused to burn. The fire consumed everything else, but his heart stayed intact. So the monks placed it in a glass case and declared it sacred. Because really, what else could they do? Believe what you want about the heart thing, but the government was too busy panicking to explain it. And then they had bigger problems anyway. The Ngô Brothers Assassination, 1963. By the fall of 1963, South Vietnam was trapped under the grip of two brothers who treated the state like a family business. President Ngo Dinh Diem wore the title, but his younger brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, pulled the strings. Together, they'd alienated the Buddhists, angered the army, and embarrassed the Americans who had been keeping them afloat with weapons, cash, and political cover. By November, the only people they could count on were each other. The tipping point wasn't just their awful leadership. It was how openly they kept poking the hornet's nest. Nhu had built a secret paramilitary force that terrorized civilians. Buddhist monks were being beaten, arrested, and in some cases, made to disappear. All the while, Diem was on TV insisting everything was fine, even as monks literally set themselves on fire in public. It was an international PR disaster, and Washington started making quiet calls to anyone in the South Vietnamese army who might be open to adjustments in leadership. And if you think that kind of quiet scheming sounds bad, just wait until you hear about the Gulf of Tonkin, because that's when things really spiraled. On November 1, 1963, South Vietnamese generals launched a coup. The palace was surrounded, and the brothers fled. They ended up hiding in a church for a few hours until they were found and arrested the next morning. What happened next was supposed to be an escort to safety. Instead, both were executed in the back of an armored carrier. Some accounts say shot, others say stabbed. What's certain is that it was neither clean nor accidental. The generals claimed it had all gotten out of hand. The U.S. pretended to be shocked, but make no mistake, Washington knew the coup was coming. They basically greenlit it without explicitly saying the words. And once it was done, they moved on like it was a regrettable paperwork error. The fallout was immediate. South Vietnam spiraled into years of unstable military rule, and Diem's death didn't fix much. It just cleared space for new problems. Corruption didn't end, repression didn't stop, and America soon found itself deeper in the mess than ever before. Diem and Nhu were mourned by many, but their assassination was a turning point, one of those moments when a bad situation quietly tips into something irreversible. If you think one political assassination is wild, wait till Tier 5, and you'll see how the US handled its own citizens when things got ugly. But first, let me explain the incident many people say is responsible for starting the war. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident, 1964. This was the moment one murky blip on a radar screen gave the US the excuse it needed to go all in on Vietnam. The first clash was real enough. On August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox traded fire with North Vietnamese torpedo boats, and at least one enemy vessel was damaged. But the second attack 2 nights later, that one was pure imagination. That night, the weather was rough, and the ship picked up odd radar signals, sonar pings, and what sounded like incoming torpedoes. No one actually saw an enemy boat, but the crew fired into the dark for hours anyway, just in case. By the time the sun came up, there was nothing. No wreckage, no oil slick, no enemy ships. Just open water and a ship full of confused sailors. Back in Washington, that didn't matter. President Johnson went on television and told the country America had been attacked twice. Within days, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution almost unanimously, giving him authority to escalate military involvement without a formal declaration of war. That resolution would go on to justify over 500,000 American troops being sent to Vietnam. The truth came out slowly. Years later, declassified NSA reports confirmed what some sailors had suspected all along. There was no second attack. The Navy had fired at shadows, and Washington built a war on it. Strategic Hamlet Program, 1961 to 1964. In the early 1960s, vulnerable Vietnamese villagers were crammed behind barbed wire and told to build new lives from scratch. On top of that, they were lectured on democracy, while corruption ran rampant and promised protection never showed up. All of this was done as part of something called the Strategic Hamlet Program. The program was supposed to do the opposite: fortify vulnerable rural villages, arm the locals, keep them safe from communist influence, and win hearts and minds. But in reality, it quickly spiraled into one of the most tone-deaf and self-defeating initiatives of the war. The whole thing first kicked off in early 1960s, when the US and South Vietnamese government decided that if they couldn't root out the Viet Cong in the countryside, they would just wall the countryside off instead. To achieve their goal, villagers were pulled into fenced, guarded compounds called strategic hamlets. But with rushed timelines, missing supplies, and corrupt officials, the hamlets were underdefended and poorly managed, which made it easy for guerrillas to just walk right in. By 1963, over 8 million people had been moved into more than 7,000 hamlets, but loyalty was scarce and safety was even scarcer. Some villagers actively helped the Viet Cong, not out of ideology, but because they were frustrated and figured the communists might actually leave them alone. The program backfired spectacularly. Instead of isolating the Viet Cong, the Strategic Hamlet Program handed them angry, displaced farmers who were ready to fight. Just like that, an initiative that was meant to secure the countryside turned into a new recruitment ground for the enemy. Force relations were bad enough, but later in Tier 2, you'll see soldiers taking frustration out on their own officers. Before we get to that, let's talk about what was perhaps the most important North Vietnam transportation route during the war: Ho Chi Minh Trail, 1959 to 1975. The US had satellites, helicopters, and napalm. North Vietnam had a dirt road through the jungle, and somehow that road gave the world's top military a serious run for its money. The Ho Chi Minh Trail wasn't just one trail. It was a constantly shifting spiderweb of jungle tracks, hidden supply routes, and camouflage storage sites running from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam. At its peak, it moved hundreds of tons of weapons, food, and troops every day. The US called it a trail, which makes it sound like a hiking route. But in reality, it was an underground highway system held together with bamboo, sweat, and sheer willpower. North Vietnamese troops, many of them teenagers, hauled rockets and ammos on their back or pushed bicycles overloaded with supplies through knee-deep mud. And while American planes dropped bombs by the truckload, the trail kept adapting. When bridges were destroyed, they rebuilt them overnight. When paths were cratered, they shifted. The whole thing could morph and reroute itself like it had a mind of its own. Camouflage made it almost invisible. Troops hid storage units under trees, built fake treetops over air vents, and even submerged bridges underwater. U.S. forces tried everything from aerial bombing to chemical defoliants, sensors, and raids. Yet the trail kept moving, rebuilding, and flowing as if nothing had happened. By the end of the war, the Chi Minh Trail had funneled over millions of tons of supplies into South Vietnam. The trail kept the North alive, but in Tier 4, you will see the desperate things the US tried to do to break that spirit. Tier 2, Operation Ranch Hand, 1962 to 1971. If the Ho Chi Minh Trail was the jungle's secret weapon, then Operation Ranch Hand was America's attempt to fight back. Except the weapon here was herbicidal warfare. American planes flew low over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia and dumped nearly 20 million gallons of Agent Orange and other defoliants onto forests, rice fields, and villages. The idea was simple: strip the jungle so the enemy had nowhere to hide, and wipe out their food at the same time. At first it looked like the plan was working. Forests withered, farmlands collapsed, and families lost the crops they depended on. But the spray didn't just stay on plants. It seeped into rivers and soil, and eventually into people. Vietnamese civilians got sick, and so did US soldiers stationed nearby. That's where the real damage comes from, because Agent Orange was contaminated with dioxin, one of the most toxic compounds ever made. It spread through the food chain and into the bloodstream, which meant cancers, birth defects, and immune disorders kept showing up long after the war ended. The US didn't admit how dangerous it was until decades later, and lawsuits from veterans and civilians are still being filed. Some of the sprayed forests never grew back, which says a lot of how destructive the chemicals really were. Operation Ranch Hand was supposed to deny the enemy cover, but what it mostly did was poison the land and the people on both sides. Spraying poison over jungles feels dark, but in Tier 3, the horror gets personal. That's when soldiers go after civilians face to face. In the meantime, let's get into what happens when soldiers fighting on the same side have it out for their superiors. Fragging. Life in the jungle was miserable. Day after day, soldiers were sent on patrols, ambushes, and search and destroy missions that often felt pointless to the men doing them. Morale collapsed, and some officers only made things worse by pushing their troops too far or treating them as expendable. Eventually, frustration boiled over. Some soldiers stopped taking orders and turned on the chain of command that had pushed them too far. Instead of striking the Viet Cong, they turned on their own commanders. Fragmentation grenades became the weapon of choice, since they were easy to use and nearly impossible to trace. But bullets in the middle of a firefight worked just as well. A commander might wake up to a grenade rolling into his tent at night, or he might never make it out of the jungle at all. It wasn't just about bad leadership either. Racial tensions inside the ranks added fuel to the fire, and officers who tried to crack down on drugs often ended up as targets too. Between 1969 and 1972, the Pentagon recorded hundreds of fragging cases, with more than 80 American servicemen killed by their own side. Investigations rarely led anywhere because nobody wanted to talk, and proving who pulled the pin in the chaos of war was nearly impossible. Fragging wasn't some coordinated rebellion, it was a mix of frustration and rage, a way for soldiers to say they'd had enough of a war that already felt meaningless. By the early 70s, commanders were so nervous about it that some started sleeping with pistols under their pillows and sandbags around their beds. Sometimes, the most dangerous place for a commander to be was among his own men. The Cam Net Incident. The Cam Net Incident started like a lot of Vietnam War stories, with the Viet Cong deciding to ruin someone's morning. On July 1st, 1965, they hit the U.S. airbase in Da Nang with a classic combo of mortar fire and a sapper attack. The attack involved raining down small explosive shells on an area, while a group of trained personnel called sappers infiltrated the base. By the time they were done, 3 American aircraft were smoking ruins. 3 more were damaged, and the Marines were very motivated to return the favor. The very next day, the Marines expanded their base 8 kilometers south towards the Cao Do River. The logic was simple. More space meant more patrols, which in turn meant fewer surprise visits from the Viet Cong. Except the Viet Cong weren't done. They struck again, this time firing from one of the 6 villages all named Cam Ne, especially Cam Ne 4. This time, the Marines took it personally. After a few of these back and forths, the Americans became convinced that Cam Ne wasn't just a village. It was a Viet Cong Airbnb. They were sure the locals were helping the enemy. So when the higher-ups gave the order, it was simple. Sweep the town, flush out any Viet Cong, and destroy their stronghold. On August 3rd, 1965, the Marines rolled into Cam Ne expecting a fight, but they found absolutely nothing, or at least no one they were looking for. The Viet Cong had slipped out quietly before the first Marine even broke a sweat, but the empty village still had plenty to offer, specifically trenches, booby traps, and landmines. The Marines went to work clearing everything, which in practice meant setting fire to homes and blowing up what was left. By the time they were done, 51 huts were ash, villagers were injured and homeless, and the Viet Cong were untouched. The only thing defeated that day was the idea that America was the good guy. Normally, this would have been buried as just another ugly skirmish, but CBS correspondent Morley Safer was there with a camera, and millions of Americans watched Marines torch homes on the evening news. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a turning point in how the war looked back home. As you'd expect, people were outraged, and the military was embarrassed. Safer got investigated for making the Marines look bad, and the Marines defended themselves by saying the huts had to go to keep the Viet Cong out. In the end, the Marines destroyed a village, the Viet Cong got away, and a lot of Americans watching TV at home realized the war wasn't the clean, heroic story they were being sold. Soldiers turning on their own officers is one thing, but there's an entry in Tier 5 that'll make you wonder how far desperation can go when bombs start dropping at home and abroad. The Battle of Ia Drang, 1965. On the morning of November 14, 1965, about 1,000 men from the U.S. 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment were airlifted straight into the Ia Drang Valley in South Vietnam. This was the first major clash between American forces and the North Vietnamese Army, and it was anything but friendly. This battle was historic because it was the first time the U.S. tried large-scale helicopter warfare. Dozens of choppers carried troops straight into the landing zone X-ray. And before anyone touched the ground, the Americans lit the place up with artillery, airstrikes, and rocket fire. They unleashed 30 minutes of non-stop chaos. But here's the thing, the NVA wasn't caught off guard. They were ready, and they had numbers. Within hours, 3 NVA battalions surrounded the landing zone, and suddenly the Americans were trapped. They called in more air support, and U.S. forces poured more than 33,000 rounds of artillery and additional air support, including B-52s, into the valley. The NVA countered with a brutal tactic. Stay so close to American lines that calling in airstrikes meant hitting your own men. Grab them by the belt, as they called it. It forced both sides into days of hand-to-hand fighting. After 2 days, the NVA pulled back. It looked like a U.S. win, until November 17th. On the march to another landing zone, LZ Albany, the NVA ambushed them point blank. This time, there was no artillery umbrella to save them. The result was a massacre. More than half the American troops became casualties. The Battle of Ia Drang showed that helicopters and heavy firepower could grab a landing zone, but without boots on the ground and close-range tactics, Vietnam was going to be a nightmare to win. The Hanoi March. On July 6, 1966, Hanoi decided to put on a parade, but not the kind with floats or marching bands. This one had 52 American prisoners of war being walked through the streets like props in a propaganda show. North Vietnam wanted the world to see how angry they were at the U.S. for bombing their cities, and this was apparently their big idea. Almost 2 years had passed since the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and the North Vietnamese government was desperate for international sympathy. Instead of sending a strongly worded letter, they lined up the prisoners of war and tried public humiliation. 36 of the men were dragged from the Cu Loc camp, which the Americans had nicknamed the Zoo, and the other 16 came from a place called the Briar Patch. Life in those prisons was already miserable. Prisoners spent months in solitary with barely any food and no talking. At some point, they got creative and started using a tap code to communicate through the walls. The march itself started at the Hang Day Stadium in central Hanoi. Thousands of civilians gathered to watch the whole thing like they were at a sporting event. The POWs were chained together in pairs and made to march 2 miles through the streets. At first, it was awkward. Then the mob turned violent. People broke from the stands and started beating the prisoners as they passed. For a moment, it looked like a public execution. Somehow, they survived and were marched right back to their cells as if nothing had happened. The entire thing was filmed and photographed because Hanoi wanted the world to see that their people were furious. But instead of winning sympathy, they ended up looking like bullies who got a kick out of parading starved, beaten prisoners through the streets. And that's how the Hanoi March became a perfect example of how propaganda can backfire when the whole world is watching. Marching POWs through the streets was brutal, But in Tier 6, I'll show you what real desperation looks like when a city is falling apart. Tier 3, Incident on Hill 192, 1966. The incident on Hill 192 was a real-life horror story, complete with monsters and the innocent girl they preyed on. On November 17, 1966, they kidnapped Phan Thi Mao, a young Vietnamese woman, dragged her to a hut, and assaulted her. After a few days, they panicked, realized hostage for 5 days wasn't a workable plan, and decided to kill her. They might have gotten away with it. Vietnam was full of atrocities that never saw daylight. But one soldier, the only one who hadn't touched her, reported it. They dragged her to an abandoned hut, and 4 of the 5 men took turns harassing her. With that, phase 1 of their plan was complete. Phase 2, the kept her for 5 days part, never happened. Reality set in, and the soldiers started to panic about getting caught. So instead of following through with their initial plan or just letting her go, they decided to kill her. One of the men led her to a brushy area and stabbed her 3 times. But she didn't die right away. She tried to run, but they caught her and shot her at close range. This time, she didn't make it. Since the girl was dead, they thought they'd gotten away with it. But it turned out that one of the soldiers actually had a conscience. He reported the crime, and all 5 men were court-martialed and convicted. Bình Hòa Massacre, 1966. December 3, 1966, Bình Hòa Village. You're farming or with family when South Korean troops, known for brutal tactics, roll in on a routine search. And it wasn't the Americans this time. It was South Korean troops who were fighting alongside the US and South Vietnam. These guys had a reputation for being strict, which in practice meant people feared them more than the Americans, and for good reason. Between December 3rd and 6th, they turned Bình Hòa into a massacre site. It started with a house search. Soldiers found a cellar full of civilians hiding under one man's home. You'd think they'd drag the people out and arrest them, but that's not what happened. Instead, they tossed in grenades and opened fire, killing 15 people on the spot. Then it got worse. The troops kidnapped 37 villagers, mostly women and children, and marched them into a big pit and executed all of them. The next day, the soldiers decided it was time for the full massacre. They went door to door, killing anyone they came across. Women, kids, the elderly, it didn't really matter. And just in case killing hundreds of people wasn't enough, they slaughtered livestock and torched every house they could find. By the time the soldiers were done, Bình Hòa was gone, and more than 400 civilians were dead. For nearly 20 years, no one outside the province talked about it. A British journalist finally dug it up in the 80s. By then, the village was gone. The records were buried, and the war had already moved on. That's the kind of silence atrocities live on. It was yet another reminder that in the Vietnam War, danger didn't just fall from the sky in the form of bombs. Sometimes it walked right through your front door. As bad as this is, it's not even the one that made headlines worldwide. Tier 4 is where things get historically infamous. Dak Son Massacre. Surprisingly, the massacre at Dak Son didn't start with explosions or flames. Instead, it started with a few Viet Cong soldiers climbing up a perimeter wall and trying to pressure the villagers inside to hand over some people. They were told no, so they left. Then they came back. 14 months earlier, around 800 Montagnard refugees had escaped from a Viet Cong camp, where they'd been forced to work under brutal conditions. They found safety in Dak Son, and the Viet Cong wanted them back. When the villagers refused, the fighters decided that if they couldn't get their property back, they'd turn it into a public lesson by punishing the escaped captives and the villagers who dared to defy them. On December 5th, 1967, just after midnight, the Viet Cong launched a full-scale assault on the sleeping village. They brought machine guns, mortars, and flamethrowers. Their choice of weapons made it clear they hadn't come to take prisoners. They were there to kill. Houses were set on fire with people still inside, and anyone who tried to run was cut down. Families hid in foxholes under their home, but many suffocated as smoke poured in while the village burned above them. If the house didn't catch fire on its own, a grenade usually took care of it. The destruction didn't stop with people being killed. The Viet Cong fighters were determined to destroy everything and anything they came across. So they torched fields, killed livestock, and stripped the village of anything that could sustain life. By the time the flames died down, the Viet Cong had dragged 160 survivors out of hiding, shot 60 of them, and kidnapped the other 100, probably to serve as a replacement for the laborers they'd lost. By morning, Dak Son was destroyed, and 252 unarmed civilians were dead. Official reports from Hanoi later blamed U.S. bombs, but the survivors had watched men walk into their homes carrying fire. Hard to mistake that for an airstrike. Operation Cedar Falls, 1967. In 1967, the U.S. Army finally cracked the code on fighting guerrillas. Or at least, they thought they did. They decided they were going to flush the Viet Cong out of their strongest base, an area called the Iron Triangle, and call it a win. The Iron Triangle was about 120 square miles of land between the Saigon River and the Tin River, and it was pretty much Viet Cong central. It was packed with hidden tunnels, supply caches, and villagers that were happy to feed and shelter Viet Cong fighters. That morning, around 8 a.m., 420 soldiers dropped into the town of Ben Suc from 60 helicopters, and they had backup on the way. The place was believed to be a major Viet Cong hub, so naturally, that's where the show started. Villagers were told over loudspeakers to stay inside and wait for instructions, and then those instructions turned out to be, get out. Around 6,000 villagers were forced out of their homes and sent to refugee camps. One day, you're living life in the Iron Triangle, and the next, you're homeless, because someone decided your whole neighborhood is now a battlefield. Once the people were gone, the U.S. went all in on Phase 2, wiped the place off the map. Houses were burned or bulldozed, trees were flattened, and the landscape was turned into a muddy wasteland. And then came the part soldiers really loved, tunnel hunting. The Viet Cong had an entire underground world running through the Iron Triangle. It already slipped away before the troops arrived, but the Americans sent in tunnel rats, which turned out to be a code name for small soldiers trained to crawl into pitch-black, booby-trapped holes. The tunnel rats found supplies and documents, burned what they could, and then demolished the tunnels. Mission accomplished, or so they thought. As soon as the U.S. troops left, the Viet Cong came right back and picked up where they left off. Operation Cedar Falls ended up being a very expensive way to evict thousands of civilians, wreck the environment, and ultimately achieve next to nothing. The Massacre at Hue, 1968. On the morning of January 31, 1968, the people of Hue woke up to gunfire and the sound of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops marching into their city. It was the start of the Tet Offensive, and for Hue, that meant 26 straight days of urban warfare. The U.S. and South Vietnamese forces scrambled to hold ground while the city basically turned into a battlefield. Somewhere along the line, Viet Cong officers started going door to door, not to fight, but to round people up. If you had any connection to the South Vietnamese government at all, whether you were a civil servant, teacher, student, priest, monk, or just a friend of someone who once voted the wrong way, you would be arrested. At first, it looked like they were just detaining people, but then they started separating them into groups. Some were marched north for re-education, which in practice meant prison or forced labor, while the rest never made it out of Hue. One of the most chilling parts happened at a local church, where a bunch of civilians had taken refuge. The Viet Cong found them, pulled them out, and told them they were being sent to a liberated area for indoctrination. They were promised they'd be released afterward, but of course they weren't. Instead, they were marched 9 kilometers into the countryside, where 20 of them were taken aside, executed, and buried on the spot. The rest were dragged across a river and handed off to another communist unit. That unit finished the job. By the time South Vietnamese and American troops finally retook the city, Hue was in ruins. The full extent of the violence only became clear when people started digging. Throughout 1968 and into the next year, mass graves were uncovered all around the city. Thousands of bodies had been dumped into shallow pits with their hands tied behind their backs and their mouths gagged with rags. Some had clearly been tortured. Some were buried alive. By every indication, many of the victims were just regular people who'd been caught on the wrong side of a political line. More than 2,000 civilians were executed, and the total death toll hit over 5,000. The Battle of Hue may have been a military turning point in the war, but underneath the gunfire, it was also one of the deadliest mass killings of civilians in the entire conflict. And for years, a lot of people didn't even talk about it. Some still don't. The massacre was devastating. But in Tier 4, there's a single execution that was caught on camera. It went on to become one of the most unforgettable images of the war. Tier 4, the Saigon Execution, 1968. If the Saigon Execution happened today, the video would hit every social media feed in seconds. But back in 1968, all the world got was a single photo. On February 1, 1968, Associated Press photographer Eddie Adams found himself at the scene of a street execution. The Tet Offensive had kicked off a few days earlier, and South Vietnam was basically on fire. Eddie wasn't just a photographer, though. He was a former U.S. Marine, which meant he had the kind of mindset where running toward gunfire seemed reasonable. For him, war photography was just another day at work. That morning, Eddie got a tip that a firefight had broken out nearby, so he grabbed his camera and went straight to it. When he arrived, it was weirdly quiet. The news crews were about to leave when something caught everyone's attention. South Vietnamese Marines were dragging a man down the street. He was in a plaid shirt, his hands tied behind his back, and he looked like a random civilian. His name was Nguyen Van Lem, and while he didn't look like a soldier, he was actually a Viet Cong captain. On the surface, he and his wife ran a tire shop. In reality, they were arms dealers for the Viet Cong. Lem had just been captured by General Nguyen Ngoc Loan, South Vietnam's chief of police. Loan wanted him executed immediately, but the soldiers hesitated. So Loan did it himself. He raised his pistol, pressed it to Lem's head, and pulled the trigger, right there in the middle of the street. At that exact moment, Eddie Adams clicked his camera. The photo captured Lem's final expression as he collapsed, blood pouring from his head. Loan later justified the killing by saying Lem wasn't in uniform and that he had murdered a South Vietnamese officer. But Eddie's photo made the explanations feel irrelevant. By the next day, the image was splashed across newspapers in the United States, and Americans saw the war in a way they couldn't ignore. Eddie Adams went on to win a Pulitzer Prize for the shot, and the picture became one of the most famous and most haunting images of the Vietnam War, Phong Nhi and Phong Nhat Massacre. On the morning of February 12, 1968, two small hamlets in Quang Nam Province, Phong Nhi and Phong Nhat, woke up to the sound of South Korean Marines rolling in. The Tet Offensive has just rocked South Vietnam, and these troops weren't in the mood for mercy. Officially, they were hunting Viet Cong guerrillas. In practice, they went after the people who couldn't fight back. The Marines swept through the hamlets, killing civilians on sight, torching homes, and tossing some victims into village wells. Within hours, the two peaceful hamlets had turned into killing grounds. Among the survivors was 8-year-old Nguyen Thi Thanh, who was hiding in an underground shelter with her family. The soldiers found them, forced them out, and shot them. Nguyen was hit in the stomach and somehow lived, but her entire family was killed. When the troops left, 79 civilians were dead, and the villages were scattered with bodies. For decades, nobody talked about the massacre. Nguyen kept her scar and her story to herself until she finally testified in South Korea in 2020. In court, she showed the scar on her stomach as proof of what had been done to her. In 2023, a South Korean court ordered the government to pay her over 30 million won, which is about $24,000. It was the first time South Korea officially admitted responsibility for the Phong Nhi and Phong Nhat massacre, and it came decades after its soldiers had wiped out two villages in a single morning. If this doesn't sit right with you, you should know that in Tier 6, there are prison stories that still make veterans shiver. My Lai Massacre, 1968. On the morning of March 16, 1968, the people of My Lai were starting their day like any other. They were cooking breakfast, tending animals, and chatting outside their homes, and no one was expecting trouble. Then, soldiers from Charlie Company, 11th Brigade, walked into the village. But the soldiers hadn't come for a friendly visit. The night before, their captain, Ernest Medina, told them the village was basically empty and that only Viet Cong fighters or their supporters would still be there. He gave them clear orders. Kill everyone you find. Kill the livestock, poison the wells, and burn the village to the ground. Except Medina was wrong, and the soldiers realized it immediately. The village was full of civilians, men, women, and children who weren't even hiding. At first, the soldiers searched for the Viet Cong, but they didn't find any. Instead of leaving, they turned their guns on the people in front of them. The villagers were rounded up in groups, and the soldiers opened fire. Some were shot in rice paddies, and others were killed in an irrigation ditch. One soldier even pushed a villager into a well and threw a grenade in after him for good measure. Another soldier came across 20 villagers praying at a temple, and he shot every single one of them. Then it got worse. Women who tried to shield their children were killed, and then the kids were killed too. Some women, and even girls as young as 12, were gang R-worded before the soldiers mutilated their bodies. The troops shot livestock, burned homes, and kept killing until more than 500 civilians were dead. A U.S. helicopter pilot named Hugh Thompson Jr. saw the massacre from above, and when he noticed soldiers moving towards a bunker where women and children were hiding, he landed his helicopter between them. He confronted the soldiers and managed to get some of the civilians out alive. The U.S. Army tried to cover it all up, claiming it was just a battle against Viet Cong, but witnesses and photos told the real story. Eventually, 26 soldiers were charged, and only one guy, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted. He served just 3.5 years under house arrest. Girltron, 1968. Some of the most haunting images from Vietnam weren't of battlefields. They were of children who had nothing to do with the fighting. One of them was Girltron, who was only 12 years old when she was photographed by Life magazine's Larry Burroughs. Girltron's government name was Nguyen Thi Tron, and in 1968 she was living in Saigon. Burroughs wasn't new to any of this. He'd been photographing the Vietnam War since 1962, so he'd already spent years alongside American troops, wading through mud and dodging gunfire. He had seen more dead bodies, blood, and burned-out villages than anyone would want to admit. But the day he took the iconic Girltron photo didn't start with anything dramatic. It was just two kids playing on a swing inside a Red Cross compound. When he looked closer, he realized one of the girls, who he later found out was Tron, had just one leg. A few months earlier, she had been doing something very normal, collecting firewood and picking plants. The problem was she was doing it in an area where the Viet Cong were active. She didn't know it, but the Americans had already decided that anything that moved there was fair game. A U.S. helicopter spotted her, opened fire, and the bullets tore into her leg. She survived the attack, but the damage was so bad that doctors had to amputate. Burroughs asked about her story and decided the world needed to see it. On November 8, 1968, Life magazine published his photo with the headline, "As the bombing stops, this girl, Tron." The photo became one of Burroughs' most memorable shots. Tron's name got out, her story spread, and she even had a short-lived friendship with the photographer who noticed her. Burroughs was killed in 1971 while covering the war, but the Girltron photo still shows that the Vietnam War hit ordinary homes and playgrounds, not just jungles. The Cambodian Incursion, 1970. The Cambodian Incursion kicked off in April 1970, and it was the real case of the friend of my enemy is my enemy too. Here's what was going on. Since 1963, the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong had been sneaking across the border into Cambodia and setting up shop. Cambodia wanted nothing to do with the Vietnam War. They had a weak military, shared a border with Vietnam, and decided to stay officially neutral. But neutrality didn't stop the North Vietnamese. They were moving in and out of the eastern part of Cambodia through the infamous Chi Minh Trail, and no one was stopping them. They built secret base camps there, where they could rest, regroup, and plan their next moves without worrying about American bombs or South Vietnamese raids. These bases had everything: food, weapons, ammo, and enough supplies to keep the war machine going. By 1969, President Richard Nixon was done watching. He secretly ordered bombing runs on eastern Cambodia to hit the supply lines and force the North Vietnamese out. But he didn't stop at airstrikes. He also planned for U.S. and South Vietnamese troops to actually cross the border and hit those camps on the ground. If the bombs didn't wipe the bases out, then the foot soldiers would. In April 1970, about 48,000 South Vietnamese troops marched into Cambodia, and they were soon joined by 32,000 American soldiers. Together, they went after the North Vietnamese camps, and as they moved in, the enemy forces slipped deeper into Cambodia, leaving destruction behind them. The operation was technically a success because thousands of tons of weapons, food, and supplies were destroyed, and secret documents exposing North Vietnamese strategy were captured. But the victory came at a heavy cost. By the time the incursion wrapped up in June, the North had lost around 11,000 fighters. South Vietnam had lost more than 1,000, and the U.S. had lost 338 soldiers. In the end, Cambodia paid the biggest price, because being neutral only turned their country into a battlefield. If they'd had the strength to pick a side, maybe they wouldn't have ended up as the unwilling host of someone else's war. Tier 5. The Kent State Massacre. A few days after the Cambodian incursion began, the U.S. managed to make an already bad situation even worse. On April 30, 1970, President Richard Nixon went on television and casually announced that U.S. forces were invading Cambodia to take out North Vietnamese camps. To most Americans, this sounded like the government had decided to pick a fight in a neutral country just to see what would happen. For students who were already tired of the Vietnam War, it was the last straw. They weren't soldiers, but they were done watching their government expand a war that wasn't going well in the first place, so they started protesting. Kent State University in Ohio was one of the loudest campuses. On May 1st, the students started their protest. They marched, chanted, and even got theatrical about it. A group of history majors held a little ceremony where they buried a copy of the U.S. Constitution to symbolize Nixon killing it. The display did exactly what the group wanted it to. It got people's attention. By May 4th, about 2,000 students had gathered in different spots on campus. There was no central leadership, which is basically an invitation for chaos. The protests were mostly quiet at first, with flag waving and students chanting. But then the Ohio National Guard showed up. They went through the usual routine and yelled at the crowd to clear out, but nobody listened. Since Plan A failed miserably, the Guard decided it was time for Plan B. They fired tear gas into the crowd, but that didn't work either. It only pushed the students back a little and made them mad. They retaliated by throwing rocks, and that was all it took for things to spiral out of control. Then came the moment that would burn this protest into history. Around 12:24 p.m., 29 guardsmen turned towards the students and opened fire. It lasted only 13 seconds, but in that time, 67 rounds tore across the campus. Students screamed, ran, and hit the ground, and some never got up. When the chaos finally cleared, 4 students were dead and 9 others were wounded. One of them was left paralyzed for the rest of their life. News of the shooting sparked nationwide outrage. Over 4 million students across more than 1,300 colleges and universities walked out in protest, creating the largest student strike in U.S. history. Campuses closed, streets filled with demonstrators, and suddenly the Vietnam War wasn't just an overseas problem anymore. It was at America's own doorstep. The U.S. went to Vietnam to stop a war, but the Kent State Massacre showed that it had brought one home. The massacre made it clear that the Vietnam War wasn't just tearing apart villages overseas. It was also tearing apart the country that sent the soldiers there in the first place. Phoenix Program. To put it simply, the Phoenix Program was America and South Vietnam's answer to the Viet Cong political network. It was a brainchild of the CIA, and those guys aren't exactly famous for valuing human life, so I'm sure you can guess where this is going. The program ran from 1968 to 1972, and it played out like a grim spy movie. CIA operatives and South Vietnamese forces infiltrated the Viet Cong and gathered intelligence from the streets. Everyone was a suspect. Your neighbor, the shopkeeper, even the guy who sold you grenades could be on the CIA's payroll, ready to snitch for a few extra bucks. Once someone was tagged as Viet Cong, there were really only 2 outcomes: assassination or capture. If you got captured, that's when things went from bad to worse. Interrogation was just a nice word for torture, and the methods were exactly as awful as you'd think. Prisoners were beaten, harassed, waterboarded, starved, and electrocuted. Sometimes, the interrogators would attach wires to a prisoner's genitals or tongue and flip the switch. Some accounts from the program are almost hard to believe, but they're real. One intelligence officer recalled watching interrogators hammer a 6-inch wooden dowel into a prisoner's ear canal until it reached his brain. Another account described 3 doctors using prisoners as test subjects for electroshock experiments, zapping them up to 60 times a day for a week. The goal was to see if they could alter human behavior. It didn't work. All it did was kill people. Despite all the horror it caused, the Phoenix program was called a success because the numbers looked good. By 1972, 81,740 suspected Viet Cong had been captured, killed, or flipped to the other side. The Viet Cong's political infrastructure was effectively shattered. But in this case, success came at the cost of turning intelligence work into a nightmare factory. Napalm Girl, 1972. It was June 8, 1972, and South Vietnamese planes had just dropped napalm on the town of Trang Bang. Napalm is gasoline turned into jelly, and once it hits you, it clings to your skin and keeps burning until there's nothing left to burn. If fire could hold a grudge, this would be how it showed it. Phan Thi Kim Phuc, who the world would later come to know as Napalm Girl, lived there with her family. The town had been under North Vietnamese occupation for a while, and the South Vietnamese army had been trying and failing to drive them out for 3 days. So they decided to bring in their big solution, which in this case was napalm airstrikes. At the time of the bombing, Phuc and her family, along with many other civilians, were hiding at a nearby Buddhist temple. When the bombs started falling, the entire area was thrown into chaos. In the middle of it, Phuc's clothes caught fire. She ripped them off while running for her life, and the 9-year-old girl ended up sprinting naked down the highway, just trying to escape the flames. This was the moment Vietnamese photographer Nick Ut took the famous photo. It showed Phuc screaming and running alongside other terrified villagers. After taking the picture, Nick Ut did what you'd expect from a decent human being. He rushed over, poured water on her burns, and helped get her and other children into a van. He drove them to a nearby hospital, where doctors took one look at her and assumed she wouldn't make it. But she did. After 14 months in the hospital and 17 surgeries, Phuc survived and eventually returned home. Meanwhile, Nick Ut's photo spread across the world, shocking audiences who thought they'd already seen the worst of the war. It fueled anti-war protests in the US, hardened international criticism, and became one of the defining images that turned public opinion against America's involvement in Vietnam. The picture got so popular that in 1973, Ut won the Pulitzer Prize for it. Christmas bombing, 1972. In December 1972, North Vietnam found out that Christmas could come with B-52s instead of carols. From the 18th to the 29th, the skies over Hanoi and Haiphong were packed with American bombers dropping wave after wave of bombs. By the end of 1972, the war was dragging, and peace talks were limping along in Paris. Then, they completely stalled. North Vietnam didn't like the terms, refused to set a new date, and basically walked away with a middle finger in the air. By December 16th, the talks had gone nowhere, and U.S. President Richard Nixon decided he'd had enough. He gave North Vietnam 72 hours to return to the table or face grave consequences. 72 hours later, Nixon kept his promise. On December 18th, the U.S. launched Operation Linebacker 2, a massive bombing campaign targeting North Vietnam's military and industrial zones. The first night alone saw waves of bombs hitting airfields like Kep, Phuc Yen, and Hoa Lo, along with a massive rail and warehouse complex at Yen Vien. Once the bombing started, it didn't slow down. For the next 11 days, over 200 American B-52 bombers dropped more than 20,000 tons of explosives. And while the North Vietnamese fired back, shooting down at least 16 bombers, it was the people on the ground who paid the heaviest price. One hospital in southern Hanoi was hit with over 100 bombs in a single day. Doctors and nurses were killed where they stood. Patients were buried in rubble, and the building was gone. The U.S. military claimed the hospital was hiding anti-aircraft weapons, but for the civilians inside, that didn't really matter. Americans called it the Christmas bombings, even though they paused for December 25 like it was some kind of courtesy break. By the 26th, the sky was roaring again, and the bombing didn't stop until December 30, when Nixon finally called it off. North Vietnam returned to the negotiating table, and the Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973, ending direct U.S. involvement in the war. But it only happened after Operation Linebacker had killed around 1,600 civilians. The bombings forced Hanoi back to Paris, but they also stripped away what was left of America's credibility. Tiger cages. We've already been through plenty of grim stuff in this iceberg, but it only gets worse the further down we go. One of the darkest stops is Con Son Prison, where tiger cages turn captivity into something far beyond a normal cell. These underground pits made regular prisons look almost humane. The French built Con Son during colonial times, but the South Vietnamese ran it during the war, and they didn't use it for rehabilitation. The tiger cages were a separate block of 120 little pits with iron bars on top, like something you'd see in a zoo, except instead of tigers, they held people. People who couldn't even stand up straight or sit comfortably. The sun beat down on them all day, and the guards called it sunbathing, which sounds relaxing until you remember there was no water, no shade, and no sunscreen. Just heat, disease, and starvation. Guards could stroll across the bars and do pretty much whatever they wanted. Sometimes they poked prisoners with sticks, and other times they dumped quicklime mixed with water into the cages. Quicklime burns skin and can cause blindness. For years, the world didn't know this was happening, and the South Vietnamese government certainly wasn't going to advertise it. That changed in 1970, when American journalist Don Luce and congressional aide Tom Harkin, yes, the guy who later became a senator, visited the prison with a press team. They photographed prisoners who were stick-thin, filthy, and barely alive. When the images were published, it was a PR disaster for the U.S. and South Vietnam. because now the world knew that they were responsible for keeping humans in cages, like animals. And if you think this is bad, just wait until you see the last days of Saigon. Tier 6. Torture in Hoa Lo Prison. When you hear Hanoi Hilton, you probably picture bellboys, room service, and maybe a pool. Yeah, no. In Vietnam, the Hanoi Hilton was Hoa Lo Prison, and what it really had to offer was rats, starvation, and torture. The place was built by the French in the late 1800s because Vietnamese people wanted independence. The French solution was to build a prison where you could lock up anyone who got too patriotic and, convince them to calm down. Fast forward a few decades and the North Vietnamese took over. By the Vietnam War, Hoa Lo was where American pilots prayed they'd never end up. If you were a wartime pilot and your plane got shot down over the North, congratulations. You just won an all-expenses-paid trip to the Hanoi Hilton. The conditions were awful, but not in the way movies like to dramatize. There was nothing elaborate about it. It was just miserable. The cells were cramped and filthy. There was barely any food. The beds were just cold cement slabs, and the rats? Let's just say you were never really sleeping alone. But the real problem wasn't the rats. It was the torture. Guards tied prisoners in positions that twisted their bodies until their shoulders dislocated. Beatings were routine. Solitary confinement was like being stuffed in a dark shoebox for weeks, and all of it was meant to break you before they even asked the first question. The Americans stuck there gave the place its sarcastic nickname, Hanoi Hilton, because, well, if you can't leave, you might as well make a joke about it. When the prisoners of war finally came home in 1973, during Operation Homecoming, they brought stories that painted a picture that North Vietnam denied completely. North Vietnam kept insisting the prisoners had been treated well, but U.S. testimonies and internal reports described routine beatings, starvation, and years of sleeping on bare concrete. The Battle of Ban Me Thuot. By early 1975, the North Vietnamese had figured out that South Vietnam was running on fumes. The war had been dragging for years. U.S. troops were mostly gone, and the South Vietnamese army, known as the ARVN, was holding on with more hope than actual strength. So in March, the North decided to aim straight for the Central Highlands, and the city of Ban Me Thuot became their top target. It made sense because the city was the ARVN's stronghold in the region, and taking it could unravel South Vietnam's entire defense line. The plan was called Campaign 275, and it relied on stealth. North Vietnamese troops quietly crept into position around the city, slipping past intelligence and patrols like they had done 100 times before. By March 10th, they were ready. They launched their assault from multiple directions, striking key roads, the Phuong Duc airfield, and the ARVN's infantry regiment headquarters all at once. On paper, the South Vietnamese had plenty of firepower. They had 146 artillery guns and 117 armored vehicles, and they still had some air support. But on the ground, numbers matter more than equipment, and the ARVN was heavily outnumbered. The North Vietnamese pushed through the streets fast, and by next morning, most of Ban Me Thuot's main roads were under their control. The ARVN tried everything to turn the tide in their favor, from airstrikes and desperate counterattacks to digging in at the airfield. But things just kept falling apart. By March 12, the South Vietnamese command pulled everyone back to the division headquarters to plan a counterattack, only to find that their leadership had basically disappeared. Many of their top officers had been captured, leaving the soldiers like a headless army trying to hold a city that was already lost. At that point, the higher-ups ordered what was left of their troops to withdraw, but even that turned into a disaster, and many soldiers were killed on the way out. When it was finally over, the ARVN had suffered huge losses. 4,502 soldiers had been killed, and 16,822 were captured. Ban Me Thuot fell, and with it, the Central Highlands collapsed. By winning this battle, North Vietnam punched a hole in South Vietnam's defenses that the country never really recovered from. Vietnamese Evacuation. By early 1975, South Vietnam was collapsing like a badly stacked game of Jenga. The North Vietnamese had launched Campaign 275. Ban Me Thuot had already fallen, and the U.S. government suddenly realized something awkward. American citizens were still in the country, and they were now in real danger. The bigger problem was that Congress had already cut funding for South Vietnam's military, leaving President Gerald Ford with few options. He tried asking for emergency aid, but that didn't go well. With ARVN falling apart and American influence crumbling, Ford had only one card left to play. get as many people out as fast as possible. At first, the evacuation was supposed to be discreet, quiet flights and small numbers, to avoid spreading panic. That plan lasted for about 5 minutes. As soon as word spread, crowds swarmed airports, ports, and any spot where a rumor of escape popped up. People begged soldiers for a seat on helicopters, tried sneaking onto cargo ships, and even clung to vehicles heading toward airfields. It was the beginning of what history would call the Fall of Saigon. In the middle of this chaos was Peter Thompson, a former U.S. State Department employee. He'd been reassigned to India years earlier, but his wife's family was still in Vietnam, and he wasn't about to leave them behind. The U.S. government had already started discouraging Americans from entering the country, which was a pretty big hint that this was a bad idea. Thompson went anyway. When he reached Saigon, he found the U.S. Embassy running on fumes. The staff was exhausted, outnumbered, and trying to manage a human tidal wave. Thompson wanted to get his relatives out, but the only way to do it was to help. He became an unofficial embassy driver and started transporting evacuees from a secret pickup point to a safe house, and eventually to the airport for flights out of the country. On evacuation day, things really got out of hand. Thompson had one van, and over 100 people needed rides. He crammed them all in one trip while dodging chaos and running the risk of being stopped by approaching Viet Cong forces. Somehow he pulled it off. He was able to get his family and dozens of others to safety. Thompson survived the ordeal and went on to have a long diplomatic career, even becoming the U.S. ambassador to Armenia in the 1990s. For everyone in Vietnam that spring, the evacuations were chaotic and dangerous, driven by panic, luck, and quick decisions. It was the final phase of America's messy withdrawal from a war it couldn't win. Fall of Saigon. On April 30, 1975, the Vietnam War ended with North Vietnamese tanks crashing through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. South Vietnam had been collapsing for weeks, and the North's last push cut through what was left of ARVN's army like it wasn't even there. The city was tense, but strangely quiet that morning. Streets were clogged with people trying to escape, and you could hear the low thud of artillery in the distance. By the time the North Vietnamese tank number 843 smashed through the palace gate, South Vietnam's president, Duong Van Minh, had already surrendered over the radio. He told his forces to lay down their weapons because there was no fight left to give. Inside the palace, the soldiers found no resistance. Instead, they came face to face with the last government officials who were waiting to be taken prisoner. A National Liberation Front flag went up over the building. And that was it. After 20 years of war, Saigon had fallen. Outside the palace, helicopters from Operation Frequent Wind were still evacuating Americans and a few lucky South Vietnamese from rooftops, while thousands of others swarmed the U.S. Embassy and airport, begging for a way out. Once the tanks reached the city center, it was clear the war was over. The last U.S. Marines left the embassy roof, and in a few months, Saigon became Ho Chi Minh City. The fall of Saigon marked the end of the Vietnam War. For South Vietnamese civilians, it meant purges, re-education camps, and mass escapes. For the U.S., it was the final public defeat. That's all we have for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe.